1886. The Arizona Territory was a raw, scorched parchment waiting for a signature of either survival or ruin. Red Elk Crossing was a failed sentence scrawled at its margin. The town existed on a bluff of patience, clinging to the edges of a dry wash that locals still called a creek, mostly out of habit. A single bridge, its timbers bleached and bowed, spanned the dusty scar where water should have been. The wind, a constant, restless tenant, did nothing to cool the air. It only moved the heat around, lifting the fine red grit from the street and driving it against the warped facades of the mercantile, the smithy, and the saloon that called itself the Arid Heart. The hired wagon groaned to a halt, its wheels settling into the thick dust. For a long moment, nothing moved except the heat rising in waves from the ground. Then, the canvas flap was pushed aside and Eleanor Whitcomb descended. She was not a woman built for delicate arrivals. She was tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a yoke, or a burden, which she had done for most of her life. Her hands, gripping the handles of a single, scarred pine chest, were not the hands of a lady. They were chapped, the knuckles prominent, the palms mapped with the calluses of labor. She wore a dress of functional gray broadcloth, stained dark with sweat at the collar and back. She hauled the chest from the wagon bed with a grunt, settling it in the dust without ceremony. It was her only anchor. The town, which had seemed dormant, watched. From the shade of the smithy's overhang, 3 cowboys stopped their whittling. They did not whistle. Their assessment was quieter, more insulting. A low chuckle passed between them, a shared joke about the sheer size of her, the way the wagon seemed to lift an inch when she stepped clear. Across the street, a woman with a face like dried leather, the matron of the Arid Heart, leaned against the bat-wing doors. Her voice, loud enough to carry, cracked like dry mud. "We grow 'em large out here," she called to no one in particular. "But that's a new strain for the territory." A hot spike of shame, familiar and sharp, jabbed beneath Nell's ribs. She felt the blood rush to her face, felt the itch of the grit on her neck. She could feel the weight of their eyes, measuring her, dismissing her. She did not look at them. She kept her gaze fixed on the sagging porch of the mercantile, her spine a steel rod, her jaw set, a small muscle nodding. She had eaten worse insults for breakfast. The driver of the wagon, eager to be paid and gone, cleared his throat. "That'll be $4, ma'am, as agreed." She reached into a small reticule, her movements stiff, and counted out the coins as his wagon rattled away, leaving her alone with her chest in the center of the hostile street. A new silence fell. It was the silence of a town deciding if a stranger was prey. Then, the door of the mercantile opened, and the town's center of gravity emerged. Calder Boone was a man who wore his success like a well-tailored coat, while the rest of Red Elk Crossing was dusty and frayed. He was pressed and clean. He wore a dark vest over a white shirt, his boots polished, his face clean-shaven save for a neat mustache. He smelled faintly of expensive cigar smoke and lye soap, a scent of order in a world of chaos. The lounging cowboys subtly straightened, their lazy posture tightening into something approaching respect. "Mr. Boone," one of them murmured, touching the brim of his hat. Boone paid them no mind. His attention was fixed entirely on Nell. He moved with a practiced, unhurried calm, the walk of a man who had won his battles long ago and expected no new challenges. He stopped a few feet from her and tipped his hat, a gesture of civility that felt almost shocking in the coarse air. "Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, I presume?" His voice was measured, smooth as river stone, carrying easily without seeming to be raised. "I am Calder Boone. Welcome to Red Elk Crossing." Nell nodded, her throat tight from the dust and the tension. "Mr. Boone?" He extended a hand. It was clean. The nails filed. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, intensely aware of her own grime, before placing her hand in his. His grip was not the crushing grip of a laborer, but it was encompassing, soft and dry. He held it just a second longer than necessary. "I trust your journey was not overly taxing," he said, his eyes scanning her face, then her broad shoulders, but with none of the crude assessment of the cowboys. His was the look of a man appraising horseflesh, or timber, or land, a look of utility. "It was long," Nell said simply. "The territory is defined by its distances." He smiled, a polite arrangement of his features, "and by the character of those who dare to cross them. I received your letter, of course. You have." He paused, choosing the word. "A reputation for managing difficult stock." Nell's chin lifted. "I have a reputation. Mr. Boone, I was told you were looking for a herd manager, not a history lesson." The saloon matron barked a short laugh, but Boone's smile did not waver. If anything, it widened. "Excellent. Honesty, it is the bedrock of good business. The future. Miss Whitcomb is what we build here, not what we drag behind us. My ranch, Twin Mesas, requires a firm hand. It requires someone who understands that respect is not given, but earned through hard work." He spoke the words future and respect as if they were commodities he owned and could dispense at will. He was offering her a role that, in this town, was unthinkable for a woman. He was offering her a shield, and she needed one. This was her last stop. She had spent her last dollars on that wagon, running from the whispers and accusations that had chased her out of 3 counties. She wanted, with an ache that felt like hunger, a clean start. She clung to the belief that honest, back-breaking labor could scour the stains from her name, even if it could not scour them from her memory. "I am not afraid of work, sir," she said, her voice low. "I did not take you for a woman who was," he replied. He gestured to her chest, and then to a sturdy buggy parked nearby, its leatherwork dark and oiled. "Allow me. We can have one of the men fetch your things." "I can manage it," she said, bending to grasp the handles. Boone watched her lift the heavy chest, her arms straining but holding, and place it in the back of his buggy. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe you can." He led her away from the hostile eyes of the street, the buggy wheels cutting a clean line through the dust. They rode out of Red Elk Crossing, past the last few hopeful, failing homesteads, and into the sun-scorched expanse of Boone's holdings. He spoke smoothly as they rode, pointing out his boundaries, marked by a distant mesa or a line of barbed wire glinting in the merciless sun. He spoke of the railroad, of water rights, of the stubbornness of cattle and the untrustworthiness of men. Nell listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The land was vast and brutal, a mix of red rock and thorny mesquite. It was a land that demanded strength, and for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. She felt a challenge. They arrived at Twin Mesas Ranch as the sun began to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The ranch was large. The main house, a 2-story wooden structure that had once been impressive, but the entire place seemed to be fraying at the edges. The long line of the corral fence was tilting. Several posts rotted at the base. The main barn, though huge, had a visible sag in its roofline. This was not a pristine empire. It was a place that needed a firm hand. Just as he had said, it needed her. Boone showed her to a small, detached foreman's cabin. It was one room, clean but bare, with a cot, a stove, and a single wooden chair. "This will suffice, I hope, until you are settled," he said. "It is more than enough," Nell said, her voice thick. "Good. My hands are accustomed to taking orders from me. Miss Whitcomb, they will now take them from you. Breakfast is at 5, supper is at 7. Your work begins tomorrow." He tipped his hat again and left her, his boots making decisive sounds on the hard-packed earth. Nell stood in the doorway of her new home. She set her chest down, the sound of the wood hitting the floorboards a solid, definitive thud. She stepped outside again, breathing in the air. It was different here than in town. It was not the smell of despair. It was the sharp, honest tang of horse sweat from the corrals, the dusty sweetness of old leather and hay from the barn, and the distant, lonely call of a crow settling for the night. This was real. She looked out over the ranch, a kingdom of tilting fences and encroaching shadows. In the deep silence, she heard the echoes of the cowboy's laughter, the sting of the matron's voice. She made a vow, not to God, who had long seemed absent, but to the hard, red earth beneath her feet. "No one," she whispered, her voice rough, "will make me bow." And it was then, at the edge of her vision, that she saw him. He was at the far end of the yard, near the sheep pens, a place of lesser status than the cattle corrals. He was a man in a faded canvas coat, his back to her, mending something with deliberate, slow movements. He seemed almost a part of the landscape, as still as the juniper posts, as if sensing her gaze. He paused and looked over his shoulder. He was too far away to see clearly, but she could feel the weight of his stare. It was not the leering assessment of the cowboys or the calculated appraisal of Calder Boone. It was something else. It was the cautious, deeply knowing gaze of a man who understood exactly what this land took from a person, and who was waiting to see what it would take from her. His name, though she did not know it yet, was Elias Kincaid, and he had seen it all before. The sun at 5 in the morning was not a sunrise, but a sentence. It was the signal for labor to begin, and Nell met it on her feet, already pulling on her boots. The half-dozen ranch hands Boone employed were gathered by the cookhouse, sipping bitter coffee, their cynicism a palpable miasma in the cool air. They watched her, their eyes hooded, waiting for the Eastern woman with the broad shoulders to fail. She did not speak to them. She did not ask for their consensus. Her first act was to walk the length of the stables, her eyes taking in every detail. The place was a monument to lazy fixes. In the third stall, a heavy door sagged on a single, twisted hinge, a clear danger to any horse skittish enough to be housed within. She went to the smithy. The forge was cold, the tools disordered. With a grim set to her jaw, she found a heavy mallet, a drift, and a length of iron stock. She did not bother to light the forge. She worked the metal cold, her strength against its. The sound of her hammer on the anvil was the only sound in the yard. It was a sharp, demanding rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. She beat the twisted hinge back into true, her arms burning, sweat already tracing lines through the dust on her face. The hands stopped talking and watched. She carried the repaired hinge back, braced the heavy door with her shoulder, and set the pins. The door swung shut with a solid, satisfying thud. Her next project was the water trough. It was a long, sloppy affair of warped pine, leaking a dark stain into the dust. Wasting water here was like bleeding to underscore death. She kicked the rotted wood, and it crumbled. "This is coming down," she announced to the yard at large. One of the older hands, a man named Skeeter, spat tobacco. "That's how it's always been." "It's ending today," Nell replied. She found a pile of cured cypress wood stacked behind the barn, clearly purchased by Boone for a project and then forgotten. For 2 solid days, she worked, she measured, she sawed, she planed. The cypress was hard, unforgiving, and her hands, tough as they were, cracked and bled. She hammered the boards into place, her joints precise, her calculations exact. When she was finished, the new trough was a piece of carpentry, not a box. It was square, solid, and held water without losing a single drop. The men's silence changed. It was no longer the silence of derision. It was the silence of assessment. When she walked past the cookhouse the next morning, Skeeter nodded, his eyes on her handiwork. "That'll hold," he said. It was the highest compliment she could have imagined. On the 4th day, Calder Boone summoned her to the main house. His office was a stark contrast to the rest of the ranch. It was dark, smelling of leather and cigar smoke. A large oak desk dominated the room, and the books on the shelves were bound in leather. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, gesturing for her to sit, though she remained standing. "You have been busy." "The ranch required it," she said. He smiled, that same smooth, practiced expression. "Indeed, it seems I have hired a foreman who is also a carpenter and a blacksmith. I am impressed." He opened a drawer in his desk and produced a heavy ring of iron keys. The sound they made as he placed them on the desk was solid, a sound of possession. "These," he said, "are for you. The feed store, the granary, the harness room." He pushed them toward her. "I am also informing the mercantile in town that you have signing authority for the Twin Mesas account. Salt lick, grain supplements, basic provisions. You will manage the ledgers." Nell looked at the keys. They represented everything she had come here for. They were trust, cast in iron. She reached out and took them, the metal cold and heavy in her palm. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "Do not thank me," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I am a businessman, Miss Whitcomb. This is an investment. I am investing my trust in you. I find it almost always pays a handsome dividend." The power felt real. She took to the work with a hunger that bordered on obsession. There was a powerful bay gelding in the corral that the hands called Buckshot, a head-shy animal that fought the bit and spooked its shadows. Nell watched for a day as the men tried to break him with force. She saw the problem instantly. "It's the saddle," she told Skeeter. "He's a devil horse is all." Skeeter grumbled. Nell ignored him. She took the saddle in question to the barn. The tree was cracked, a splinter of wood digging directly into the horse's withers. It was a simple, agonizing pain that the animal had no way to explain except through violence. She spent an entire afternoon on it. She unstitched the leather, removed the damaged tree, and bound it tight with strips of wetted rawhide. She reset it, restuffed the wool padding to distribute the weight, and stitched the leather back together with a double-threaded awl and waxed flax. The next morning, she walked into the corral alone. Buckshot eyed her, his ears pinned. She did not carry a rope. She simply carried the repaired saddle. She talked to him, her voice low and steady. For 20 minutes. She let him smell the leather. She ran her hands over his back, finding the sore, scarred spot and touching it gently. Then, in one smooth motion, she swung the saddle onto his back. He shuddered, but he did not bolt. She cinched the girth slowly. She mounted him. The horse stood, trembling, but he held. She nudged him forward, and he walked. By noon, she was riding him in a clean circle. The hands did not speak of it, but they stopped calling him Buckshot and started calling him the Foreman's Bay. Elias Kincaid, the quiet man she had seen that first evening, remained a ghost. He managed Boone's small, unprofitable flock of sheep, keeping them in the high, rocky pastures where cattle could not graze. He was seen as separate, lesser than the cowboys, but he seemed to prefer it. One afternoon, a storm gathered with terrifying speed. The sky turned a sickly, bruised green, and the air became still. Nell and two hands were fighting to move a herd of 50 steers from a low-lying pasture, but the cattle were spooked, turning back on themselves. "We'll not make the high ground before it breaks," one of the hands yelled over the rising wind. Suddenly, Elias was there, riding his small, tough-looking mule. He seemed to have materialized from the rocks. He rode directly to Nell, ignoring the others. "The sky is turning," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "They won't cross the ridge," Nell shouted back, frustrated. He pointed, not with his whole hand, but with a subtle lift of his chin. "West, Coyote Gate. It is a game trail, through the arroyo, sheltered, cuts 2 miles off the ride." Nell hesitated for only a second. She trusted his knowledge. "Lead on." He did not reply, simply wheeled his mule and drove hard into the flank of the herd, turning them toward the unseen opening in the rocks. They pushed the cattle into the narrow, Sheltered passage just as the heavens opened. The rain came down not in drops, but in a solid, deafening sheet. They were soaked, but the herd was safe. By the time they reached the ranch, the worst of the flash storm had passed. Elias was gone, already heading back to his sheep, without a word of thanks spoken or expected. At night, Nell's cabin was the only light in the yard besides the main house. She was often awake until midnight. The heavy ledgers open on her small table. Boone's previous foreman had been dangerously sloppy. She spent hours correcting the entries, cross-referencing the brand tallies with the feed consumption. She began to plan the breeding lines, noting which of Boone's bulls were throwing weak calves and which were strong. The work filled her. The ache in her muscles was a dull, satisfying throb, but her mind was sharp. The numbers on the page were a language she understood, a language of consequence and fact. She was not just healing a ranch, she was healing herself. The feeling of being useful, of being competent, was a solid thing inside her, the first solid ground she had stood on in years. A week later, Boone invited her to the main house for dinner. "A celebration, Miss Whitcomb," he'd said, "of the order you have brought to Twin Mesas." The dining room was heavy with dark wood and silver. He served roasted beef and potatoes, a far cry from the stringy stew in the cookhouse. He poured wine, and he talked. He painted a picture of himself as a man struggling to hold on to his legacy, his father's inheritance, against a tide of eastern land grabbers and vultures from the railroad. "They come here with their paper contracts and their lawyers," he sighed, swirling his wine, "and they try to steal the very ground from under a man's feet. They do not understand the sweat this land requires. But you do, Miss Whitcomb." He raised his glass. "We are the same. You and I, we are builders in a world of takers." Nell felt a strange kinship. His words, so smooth and practiced, resonated with her own history of being cheated and dismissed. She saw him as an ally. She was in the granary a few days later, checking the new shipment of barley, when Martha Dupre arrived. Martha was the ranch accountant, a small, bird-like woman in a gray skirt who came out from Red Elk Crossing twice a month. Her gaze was as sharp as the point of her pen. "You are the first foreman to check the supplier's count," Martha noted, her own ledger already open. "A short sack is a stolen sack," Nell replied, marking her own tally. Martha made a small sound, almost a laugh. "Mr. Boone is a generous man," she said, her voice dropping, though they were alone. "He likes to give trust. He likes to watch people thrive on it. He makes them feel important." Nell paused, the smell of dust and grain heavy in the air. Martha looked up from her book, her eyes meeting Nell's. "But you remember this, Miss Whitcomb. A promise is just wind. A handshake is just a feeling. In this territory, the only real fence is the one made of black and white ink. Do not ever forget it." The warning was stark, cold, and unsettling. Nell nodded, but the seed of doubt was planted too late. 2 weeks later, Boone found her in the barn, his horse already saddled. He was in a hurry, his manner jovial and rushed. "Miss Whitcomb, just the woman I was looking for. A crisis. I must ride to Tucson for 3, maybe 4 days. The men's pay is due on Friday." He pulled a sheaf of folded papers from his coat pocket, along with a fountain pen. "This is just a bit of temporary authorization. It gives you the power to sign the payroll vouchers, to draw the cash from the bank in my absence. It will save you the trouble of waiting for my return, and it saves the men from waiting for their wages." It seemed perfectly reasonable. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of responsibility he had been giving her all along. She thought of Martha's words. But this was payroll. This was for the men. This was not a fence. It was a tool to do her job. "Of course, Mr. Boone," she said. He held the papers against the barn wall, uncapped the pen, and handed it to her. "Just sign here, and here. Simple authorization." She balanced on the balls of her feet, the pen in her hand. She wanted to prove his trust in her was not misplaced. She signed her name, Eleanor Whitcomb, the strokes of the pen dark and clear. "Excellent," he said, blowing on the ink to dry it. He folded the papers quickly and tucked them back into his coat. "You make everything so much more efficient. Miss Whitcomb." He swung up onto his horse, the picture of a man burdened by business, but grateful for the help. She watched him ride out. She felt capable, trusted, and in charge. She did not see the ink on the paper, or the words hidden by the fold. She did not know that the pen stroke she had just made was not an authorization. It was a confession. The bait had been taken. The heat did not arrive gradually. It descended. After a month of clear, metallic skies, the territory surrendered to a drought that baked the land into a red ceramic shell. The dry wash at Red Elk Crossing became a canyon of fine, choking powder. At Twin Mesas, the pastures turned from pale yellow to a brittle, lifeless brown. The sound of the ranch changed. The wind, which had once been a whisper through the grass, became a high, thin hiss across bare rock and skeletal mesquite. Worse was the sound of the cattle. Their lowing, once robust, became a weak, anxious call that haunted the nights. They spent their days clustered by the new cypress trough, which Nell kept full, but it was not enough. They needed grass, and the grass was gone. They grew thin, their ribs showing like barrel hoops beneath their hides, their eyes dull. Nell worked with a cold fury, riding farther and farther, searching for any patch of graze the men might have missed. She found nothing. She began to feed them the emergency grain reserves. But she knew, as she marked the diminishing supply in her ledger, that this was a losing battle. She was watching her work, her salvation, die of thirst. Calder Boone, who had been absent in Tucson for 2 weeks, returned not in his buggy, but on a lathered horse. He rode straight past the main house and found Nell by the corral, where she was examining the cracked, bleeding hoof of a young heifer. "It is bad," he said. It was not a question. "We will lose the herd in another 2 weeks, Nell stated flatly, not looking up from her work. "The water is poisoning them. Too much alkali from the low wells." "There is one chance," Boone said. He dismounted, his face a mask of grim responsibility. He was the commander facing a siege. The Sombra Verde Reservoir. It is owned by a private water consortium out of Phoenix. Nell knew of it. It was a massive, man-made lake 50 miles east, holding the entire watershed of the Mogollon Hills. "They sell water," she said. "They do," Boone affirmed. "But they will not take currency, not for the amount we need. They know the value of what they hold. They demand collateral." Nell finally straightened, wiping the sweat and grime from her face with her sleeve. "Collateral, what collateral do we have but the land, and that is yours?" Boone shook his head, his gaze sweeping over the lowing, skeletal herd. "They do not want land, Miss Whitcomb. They want something liquid, something they can seize and sell quickly if the debt is not paid. They want the herd." The words hit Nell like a physical blow. "Mortgage the cattle." "It is the only way," he said, his voice quiet, reasonable. "We use the herd to buy the water that saves the herd. It is a harsh equation, but it is the only one left to us." He was right. It was a terrible, perfect logic. She had poured her own blood and sweat into these animals. To sign them away felt like a violation, but to watch them starve was impossible. "What do you need me to do?" "I have the papers being drawn," he said. "They are complex. The consortium insists on the foreman's signature as well as the owner's. They want the signature of the person in physical possession, the one who tallies the brands. They want to know the asset is truly here." He placed a hand on the corral fence. "They will be here by evening. We must sign tonight." The meeting was held in Boone's office, the air thick and hot. The oil lamp on his desk cast long, wavering shadows. Martha Dupre was there, her small face pale, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. A man Nell had never seen, dressed in a black suit despite the heat, sat beside Boone. "Miss Whitcomb," Boone said, his tone grave. "This is Mr. Graves from the Sombra Verde Consortium. He has the agreements." Graves did not smile. He opened a leather satchel and produced a thick sheaf of documents, spreading them on the desk. The top page was dense with print. Nell, exhausted from an 18-hour day, blinked, trying to make her eyes focus. "It is a standard lien, Miss Whitcomb," Boone said smoothly, gesturing to the papers. "It pledges the cattle, as we discussed." Nell leaned forward, her eyes scanning the text. The legal language was a dense thicket, but her gaze caught on the title at the top of the first page. It did not say mortgage lien. It said, in bold, clear type, transfer of all movable assets pertaining to management. A cold spike of alarm shot through her. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice careful, "this document is titled as a transfer. I understood this was collateral, not a sale." Boone chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Mr. Graves, please excuse my foreman. She is meticulous, which is why I value her, but she is not a territorial lawyer." Before Graves could speak, Martha Dupree made a small, choked sound. All eyes turned to her. "Mr. Boone," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "She is correct. I have reviewed the duplicate. That clause on page 3, it is not a standard lien. It assigns full managerial control and title, pending a default that is not clearly defined. It is a full transfer of title, not a mortgage." The silence in the room was absolute. Nell looked at Boone. His mask of the worried commander did not slip, but his eyes hardened. He smiled, a cold, thin expression. "Miss Dupree, you are an excellent accountant, but this is the world of men and water, not numbers. This is the only document they will accept." He turned his full attention to Nell, his voice dropping, becoming an instrument of pure pressure. "Miss Whitcomb, we are wasting time. Every hour we sit here, another animal weakens. I can hear them. The men are out there right now, watching you, waiting for the woman who saved the ranch to save it again. Are you going to let a single, confusing word, put there by a Phoenix lawyer, be the death sentence for this herd?" As if summoned, there was a heavy knock on the office door. It was Skeeter, his hat in his hands, his face grim. "Foreman beg pardon, Mr. Boone, but that bay—" "The foreman's bay. He's down. Can't get him up. I think his gut's twisted from the dry feed." The news struck Nell like a stone in the chest. Her horse, the one she had saved, now dying. The urgency was a physical thing, suffocating her. The smell of the dust, the suffering of the animals, the trust of the men, the loss of her bay, it all crashed down on her. Boone was right. This was not the time for nitpicking. This was a time for action. She was saving her ranch. She was saving herself. "Where do I sign?" she said, her voice rough. Boone pushed the document forward and handed her the pen. "Here," he said, his voice softening with approval. "You are doing the right thing. Eleanor." She signed her name. The scratching of the pen was the only sound. The water came. For 3 weeks. A fragile hope returned to Twin Mesas. The cattle drank, their hides loosened, and the terrible, constant lowing subsided. Nell had lost her bay, but she had saved the herd. She had made the hard choice, and she had won. She felt, for the first time, truly secure. Then the buggy arrived. It was not Boone's. It was a polished black carriage pulled by 2 high-stepping horses, a vehicle of law and money. A man in a crisp suit, carrying a tin document box, stepped out. Calder Boone followed him. Emerging from the main house, Boone was not dressed for ranch work. He was wearing his dark vest and polished boots, the outfit he had worn the day she arrived. Nell was in the harness room, mending a bridle. When they approached, she felt a knot of cold unease. "Miss Eleanor Whitcomb?" the lawyer asked. His voice was sharp and impersonal. "I am," she said, setting the leather aside. "I am Mr. Finch, legal counsel for the newly incorporated Twin Mesas Holdings," he said. "I am here to serve these writs of attachment on all ranch assets." He turned and affixed a bright paper seal to the granary door. He pulled a new, heavy padlock from his pocket and snapped it shut. "What is this?" Nell demanded, stepping forward. "Mr. Boone, what is this?" Finch consulted his papers. "All movable assets, including but not limited to branded livestock, harvested grain, and all tools and equipment, are now the property of Twin Mesas Holdings, represented by its sole agent, Mr. Calder Boone. The transfer was finalized 3 weeks ago, as per the agreement co-signed by yourself." Co-signed, Nell's blood ran cold. "That was a mortgage lien to save the herd." And then Calder Boone smiled. The mask of the civilized rancher, the struggling partner, the grateful employer, dissolved. What was left was cold, triumphant, and reptilian. "It was a transfer. Miss Whitcomb," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You signed the herd you so capably managed over to my new corporation, a corporation which, I am afraid, you are not a part of." You tricked me," she whispered, the enormity of it crushing her. "The drought, the papers." "The papers were only the final step," Boone said, stepping closer. "You see, you were so very efficient. Your ledgers were so perfect. You documented everything." He pulled a different set of papers from his coat. "It was almost too easy. You signed for Salt Lick on the 10th of last month, but my delivery invoices show it arrived on the 12th. You authorized payroll for 6 men when, as you know, young Billy quit on the 2nd. You signed for grain shipments that, according to my real books, were inflated by nearly 20%. It is a sad, common story. Embezzlement." The words hit her, but she could not understand them. "No, I balanced those books. Martha," Boone cut in, "is a simple accountant who signed what I told her to, just as you did. You are a desperate woman with a dark past. I gave you trust, and you began to skim. You thought I would not notice." "You are lying," she breathed, the hatred rising. "Am I?" Boone smiled. "I have your signature on a dozen fraudulent vouchers. And then, when you feared discovery, you signed this." He tapped the lawyer's writ. "You signed the entire herd over to me, hoping I would not notice the missing assets. You are not only a thief, Miss Whitcomb. You are a remarkably clumsy one." He had set the trap the day he gave her the keys. Every signature, every tally, every mark she made in that ledger was a thread in the noose he was weaving. The drought was just the excuse to tighten it. "Mr. Finch," Boone said, "is prepared to file charges in Tucson. You would serve, I believe, a minimum of 10 years. Nell's vision tunneled. The walls of the barn seemed to be closing in. "But," Boone continued, holding up a hand, "I am a merciful man. I told Mr. Finch that you were simply in over your head. I have convinced him to drop the charges on one condition. You leave, now. You take your empty little chest, and you walk out of Red Elk Crossing and you never return. If you do, I will tell the men you simply could not handle the job. If you stay..." He let the threat hang in the air. The ranch hands, including Skeeter, had gathered in a silent semicircle, drawn by the confrontation. They had heard the lawyer. They had heard the word embezzlement. Nell looked at them, her heart hammering. She looked at Skeeter, the man who had nodded at her carpentry, who had respected her skill with the bay. "Skeeter," she pleaded, her voice raw. "You know me. You know the work. You know this is a lie." Skeeter looked at the ground. He looked at the lawyer. He looked at Calder Boone, the man who signed his pay. He slowly pulled his tobacco pouch from his pocket and bit off a piece, chewing for a long, agonizing moment. Then he spat in the dust, just shy of her feet. "Should have known," he muttered, turning his back. "A woman can't be trusted to run a herd." One by one, the others turned their backs. The betrayal was complete. "Mr. Finch stepped forward and pulled the harness room door shut. The door she had repaired. He slid the heavy wooden bar across. The sound was dull, final, the sound of an execution. Nell stood alone in the yard, shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so pure it was almost silent. She was back where she started, but infinitely lower. She had not just been accused, she had been framed, erased. "Go on," Boone said, gesturing to her cabin. "Get your things. Be grateful for my kindness." She turned. She looked him full in the face. Her voice was not a shout. It was a low, tearing rasp, forced from the very bottom of her soul. "I'd rather die." Boone's smile was thin. "That can be arranged, if you stay." She turned from him and walked to her cabin. Her few things were scattered. Her meticulous ledgers, her proof, were gone. Her pine chest sat in the corner, a stark reminder of her naive arrival. She did not pack. She simply closed the lid. She grasped the handles and dragged it from the cabin, out into the sun. She did not look at Boone. She did not look at the men who had turned their backs. She did not look at the ranch she had rebuilt. She put one boot in front of the other and began the long walk down the dusty track, dragging the hollow, empty weight of her life behind her. She did not walk toward Red Elk Crossing. To go there would be to walk into the center of the lie Boone had crafted. She would be met with scorn, perhaps with the marshal. She was a pariah, a branded thief. Instead, she turned east, following the dry wash, putting her back to Twin Mesas and the town that held it. She walked until the sun was a hammer in the sky, and then she kept walking. The chest, her only possession, was not heavy with belongings, but with the full weight of her failure. She dragged it through the dust, the pine runners leaving 2 long, defeated stripes in the sand. She stopped, finally, at a place that had no name other than its description, Washout Flats. It was a wide, desolate pan of cracked alkali clay, studded with withered saltbush and the skeletal remains of cholla cactus. It was a place of no value, a place where no one would build, no one would graze, and no one would look. It was the bottom. She found a slight overhang, a shallow bite in a low sandstone bluff, barely deep enough to shield her from the incessant, scouring wind. This was her new home. She had her bedroll, a small bag of cornmeal, a tin of coffee, and a canteen. She built a fire that night, not for warmth, but for the company of its small light. She used dry mesquite roots that burned hot and fast, leaving little smoke. She mixed cornmeal with a splash of brackish water from her canteen, forming a thick, gritty paste. She cooked it on a flat rock she set by the coals. The resulting cake was dry, tasting of ash and alkali. She ate it slowly, forcing herself to chew, her jaw aching. She had been there 2 days. The shame had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hard rage that settled deep in her bones. The wind was her only companion. It was not a breeze, it was an adversary. It never stopped. It shrieked at the corners of the rock, driving fine, stinging sand into her hair, her eyes, and her food. It was a constant reminder of her isolation. Her boots, the ones she had so carefully maintained, were beginning to crack. The soles were separating from the uppers, the leather drying and splitting in the relentless aridity. She sat by her fire, her back against the rock, rubbing the last of her own meager supply of tallow into the leather. It was a useless gesture. She was trying to mend the unmendable. She was trying to hold herself together. On the 3rd morning, she heard a sound that was not the wind. It was the deliberate, shuffling step of a mule. She was on her feet in an instant, her hand gripping the heavy iron skillet from her chest, her body tensed, ready for a threat, for one of Boone's men coming to drive her even further into the wilderness. Elias Kincaid appeared at the edge of her miserable camp. He did not ride in. He stopped his mule a respectful 20 yards away, watching her. His face was, as always, unreadable, carved from the same sandstone she was backed against. He was not a threat. He was a witness. He slid off the mule. He walked forward slowly, his hands visible. He stopped 10 feet from her fire. He looked at her, at the empty chest, at the pathetic corn cake sitting on the rock. He did not offer pity. His eyes were clear, acknowledging the truth of her situation without judging it. He reached into the pocket of his faded canvas coat and pulled out a small, tightly rolled bundle of oilcloth. He tossed it onto the ground near her feet. "You left your pay," he said. His voice was rough, like dry stones. Nell stared at the bundle, then at him. She had been so consumed by the betrayal she had not even thought of the wages Boone still owed her. "It is not all of it," Elias continued, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "It is what I had. The rest. He will not be paying." She did not move. To accept it was to accept charity. "It is not a gift," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "It is yours. You earned it. The trough you built holds water." Slowly, she bent and picked it up. She untied the rawhide string. Inside were $3 silver, but beneath the coins was more, a thick, curved Glover's needle, a heavy spool of waxed flax thread, and a small, round tin of saddle soap. She looked up at him, confused. He nodded at her cracked boots. "Leather is leather. It needs to be stitched before it can be held." He was not offering her charity. He was offering her tools. He was acknowledging her as a worker, a person of skill. It was a gesture of profound respect, more valuable than $1,000. He turned to get back on his mule. He paused, 1 foot in the stirrup, and looked at the sky. It was a pale, flat, brassy color. The sun a watery disk behind a high, thin haze. "Big storm tomorrow," he said. Nell's heart gave a strange, painful leap. Rain. A storm that broke the drought might change everything. Elias shook his head. He looked west, toward Twin Mesas. "Wind, dust, the sky will close." He swung his leg over the mule and rode away, disappearing into the shimmering heat. He returned just after dawn the next day. He was not alone. He was driving his entire flock of sheep, perhaps 60 or 70 animals, their coats matted with burrs and dust. They bleated nervously, their cries thin and pathetic in the vast emptiness. He did not ride to her camp, but to a shallow, 3-sided box canyon just north of her bluff. He dismounted and immediately began to work. He unstrapped a heavy brush axe from his pack and began to systematically chop down the long, thorny arms of the ocotillo cactus that grew in sparse clumps. He was building a fence, a pen. Nell watched him for 10 minutes. He worked with a steady, economical rhythm, wasting no movement. He was preparing for the storm he had predicted. She stood up. She pulled on her own work gloves, the ones she had stuffed in her pocket when she fled. She walked over to the box canyon. Elias did not look up, but she knew he was aware of her. He finished cutting a 10-foot stalk, thick with thorns. He grasped one end, preparing to drag it. Nell walked to the other end, gripped the woody stem, and lifted. They lifted it together. They did not speak. For hours, they worked, their alliance formed in the silence of shared labor. They cut and dragged the heavy, viciously thorned stalks, lashing them together with strips of rawhide Elias carried. They built a 4th wall across the mouth of the canyon, a dense, makeshift fence of interlocking spines. The sheep, sensing the shelter, huddled inside, their nervous bleating mixing with the rising, whistling sound of the wind and the distant, dry rumble of thunder. The storm hit an hour before sundown. It did not arrive like the flash flood had. It arrived like an execution. Elias had seen it first, a dark line on the western horizon. It was not a cloud, it was a wall, a solid, roiling, 1,000-foot-high wall of red dust and sand, advancing on them at the speed of a running horse. "Haboob," he grunted, pulling his bandana up over his nose. It swallowed the sun instantly. The world went from brassy daylight to an oppressive, suffocating darkness. The sound was not a whistle. It was a deafening, grinding roar, the sound of a mountain being turned to sand. The wind struck their flimsy fence, and the ocotillo stalks shrieked like living things. Nell and Elias scrambled into the pen with the sheep. The air became thick, unbreathable. It was not air. It was dirt. Fine grit blasted against their faces, forcing its way into their mouths and eyes. The static electricity in the air was so thick that the sheep's wool crackled, and sparks jumped from Nell's hair. The animals panicked. They became a solid, bleeding mass of terror, smashing against the new fence, trying to climb the rock walls. The roar of the wind was everything. In the churning chaos, Nell saw a ewe, an older mother, get thrown against the rock face by the press of the other animals. She fell, her leg twisting. She tried to get up, but the wind and the panic pinned her. She lay on her side, trembling, giving up. Nell saw the animal's absolute terror, the surrender to a force too big to fight. It was the same feeling that had paralyzed her in Boone's office. A cold fury rose in her. She fought her way through the panicked flock, pushing against the woolly bodies. She reached the ewe just as another gust tore a section of the fence loose. She grabbed her own bedroll, the heavy canvas tarp, and unrolled it with fumbling, grit-caked hands. She got down on the ground, in the filth and the terror. She braced her own back against the rock wall, pulling the injured, trembling sheep into the triangle of her body. She wrapped the heavy canvas over both of them, creating a small, dark, suffocating tent. She did not know if she was protecting the sheep or herself. She held the animal's bony, trembling body against her own, her arms wrapped around its neck. She pressed her face into its oily wool, shielding her lungs from the worst of the dust. She was protecting the last living thing she could. She was shielding her own dignity, reduced to this one small, defiant act. "You will not die," she whispered into the wool. Though she was speaking to herself, she held on as the world tried to tear itself apart around them. The storm howled for 8 solid hours. At dawn, the wind stopped. The silence that fell was as profound as the roar had been. Nell was buried. A heavy weight of silt had piled on the canvas. She pushed it off, gasping in the first clean, cold air. Her body was a single, bruised ache. The ewe scrambled to its feet, shook itself, and limped over to the rest of the flock. Nell stood up and looked. The world was gone, replaced by a new one, sculpted entirely of red dust. The landscape was smooth, alien, and silent. Elias was already standing, his back to her, examining the fence. A 20-foot section was gone, simply vanished. "Half the flock," he said. His voice was flat. "Devastation." Nell looked at the huddled survivors. Perhaps 30 sheep remained, miserable and caked in mud-like dust. She looked at the ewe she had sheltered, now standing. "Half of them are still here," she said. Elias turned, his face a mask of grit. He looked at her, then at the survivors, then at the vast, empty sky. A small, strange crack appeared in his leathery features. It was a smile, or the memory of one. It was not happy. It was a grim, profound acknowledgement. "You saved the living," he said. It was almost a week before the dust settled enough for Elias to ride to Red Elk Crossing. Nell was now an outcast, but he was just the quiet shepherd. He returned with a sack of flour, beans, and news. "The town is full of talk," he said, unloading his supplies by their shared fire. "Boone is selling—" Nell's head snapped up. "Selling what?" "The herd. Your herd," Elias said, his eyes meeting hers. "He is selling all of it, to the Desert Crown Consortium, the water company. Seems he is selling them the ranch, too, a package deal." The pieces slammed into place in Nell's mind. The fake drought, the need for her signature. He was not just stealing the herd from her. He was consolidating his assets to make one massive sale. He had used her skill to improve the herd, then used her trust to steal it. All so he could cash out, leaving the land and the lies behind. That evening, Nell walked to the edge of the flats. She looked west, toward the ranch that was no longer hers. The sun was setting, and the dust still in the high atmosphere made the entire sky a deep, bloody red. It looked like the world was on fire. She had been wrong. Her vow, "I'd rather die," had been wrong. Her desire to get the cattle back was wrong. It was all too small. The cattle did not matter. The ranch did not matter. He had taken her name. He had branded her a thief. As long as that brand held, she was a ghost, a drifter. He had not just stolen her present. He had stolen her future. "I have to get my name back," she said to the red, burning sky. She walked back to the camp. Elias was cleaning his rifle. She went to her pine chest, the one she had dragged in her shame. She opened it. She took out the small, leather-bound daybook she had always carried. The one Boone had missed. It was empty. She sat by the fire. She took out the glover's needle and the waxed thread Elias had given her. She had no ledgers. She had no proof. But she had her memory. She lit a small lantern. She opened the book. She would build her own ledger. She would build her case, one truth at a time. She began to write, her hand steady, the script precise. Brands. Twin Mesas. Pre-1886, TM on left hip. Boone's holding brand B inside a C, designed to burn over the TM. Scar tissue would be thick, raised. She paused, remembering. Feed counts. Salt lick. Ordered from Mercantile. June 4th. Delivered June 10th. Signed for by E. Whitcomb and S. Miller. Boone's claim delivered June 12th. Fraudulent signature. Payroll. Billy Anders. Quit. May 2nd. Paid out in full. May 3rd. Boone's claim full payroll drawn for 6 men. May 5th. She was not just writing. She was rebuilding her life. She was forging a weapon from the only thing he could not steal. The high, thin air of the upper ranges was a stark contrast to the thick, suffocating dust of washout flats. The surviving sheep, though weakened, moved with a new purpose, sensing the sparse, tough grasses that grew between the slabs of granite. Nell and Elias drove them slowly, moving up into the high pass known as Three Feathers. They were no longer foreman and shepherd. They were two people, a mule and 30-odd sheep, moving through a landscape that did not care if they lived or died. This was Elias's world. He was a man who spoke little, but who read the earth and sky as Nell read a ledger. He was teaching her this new language, a language of survival. "Stop," he said one afternoon, holding up a hand. The sheep milled around their feet. "Breathe." Nell, muscles aching from the climb, did as he said. She drew in a long breath. The air was sharp, with a faint, clean smell, like wet metal. "Ozone," he stated, his eyes on the northern horizon. "The wind brings it from a long way off. Rain in 2 days, maybe 3. It will come from that direction." She looked. The sky was a pale, flat blue. "There are no clouds." "The clouds, you see," he said, pointing to a few white puffs far to the south, "are just baggage. They mean nothing. The ones that matter are the ones you cannot see yet. They will be high and fast and thin, like a horse's tail. When you see them, you have 1 day to find shelter." He was giving her his knowledge, the only currency that had ever mattered. He was arming her. That night, they made camp in a deep, sheltered notch in the rock, a small canyon where a spring seeped from the stone, creating a patch of impossible green. The sheep drank and settled, their nervous energy finally spent. After a meal of beans and the last of the cornbread, they sat by the fire. The silence was deep, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the soft sounds of the resting animals. You came from the east, Elias said. It was not a question. Ohio, Nell replied, staring into the coals. My father had a farm, good land. He died, left the note to me. You lost it, he said, his voice flat. The bank, she said, her voice tight. They said a woman could not hold a note, could not manage a planting. They called it unsecured property. She picked up a stick, her grip tightening until her knuckles were white. They did not even see me. I was just a problem in their ledger. A big, strong woman. They said, good for work. They talked about me like I was a pack animal, a good draft horse they could sell to the next man. She snapped the stick and threw the pieces into the fire. I came west because I heard a person's work mattered more than their shape. Elias watched the burning sticks. He nodded slowly. The railroad, he said, his voice quiet. I came here guiding a survey crew in 1881. Hard work, good pay, or so we thought. His hands, which were mending a strap from the mule's pack, stilled. They paid us in company scrip, said it was good as silver at the company store. For a year, we blasted rock and laid ties. When the line was done, we rode into Tucson to cash out. The company office was empty. The scrip, it was just paper. They had scraped the wages from 200 men, left us stranded with nothing. That is when I learned. Learned what? Nell asked. That men like that, men like Boone, they do not see work. They only see what they can take. They see the world as a thing to be stripped. He looked at her, his eyes clear in the firelight. He did the same to you. He saw your strength, and he used it to strip that ranch clean. Their histories, different in every detail, were the same story. They were two people who had been discounted, erased by the casual cruelty of powerful men. The next day, the climb grew steeper. They were navigating a narrow, treacherous path of loose shale. The sheep struggling for footing, Nell, despite her strength, was not as accustomed to the thin air and loose rock as Elias. Her boot, the one she had stitched with the thread he gave her, slipped on a patch of loose scree. She did not fall, but she lurched, her arms flailing for balance. The small ledger book she kept tucked in her belt, the one she wrote in every night, was jarred loose and went flying, tumbling down the rocky incline. In an instant, Elias moved. He did not grab for her. He moved past her, his own feet sure as a goat's, and slid down the shale, stopping the book's fall with his boot. He bent, picked it up, and climbed back to her. You should be more careful, he said, his voice gruff. He held the book out to her. She was still breathing hard from the near fall, her heart hammering. As she reached for the book, her foot slipped again. This time, she was truly off balance. She pitched forward, a cry escaping her lips. Elias dropped the book and caught her. His hand clamped around her upper arm, just above the elbow. It was not a gentle touch. It was an anchor. It was the grip of a man arresting a fatal fall. It stopped her cold. The moment hung in the air. They were frozen on the mountainside. She was pressed against him, her face against the rough canvas of his coat, which smelled of dust, wool, and the faint, metallic tang of the high-altitude wind. His hand was a vice on her arm. She could feel the hard strength of his fingers, the solidness of him. He was the first thing that had felt truly solid since the betrayal. She found her footing, bracing herself against the rock. I am steady, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. He did not let go immediately. He held her for a second longer, as if making sure the mountain had truly settled beneath her. Then, his grip loosened, but his hand slid down her arm, his calloused palm brushing her skin, until he was holding her hand. He pulled her up the last few feet to a stable ledge. Thank you, she said, her voice unsteady. He released her hand and bent to retrieve the ledger again, his movements stiff. This is your truth, he said, pressing the book into her hand. Do not lose it. She did not pull away. She just nodded, her skin still tingling, her entire body aware of the brief, powerful contact. That night, it was colder. The stars seemed brighter, close enough to touch, and the wind had a sharp, icy edge. They built their fire in the lee of a massive granite boulder, and they sat closer than they ever had before. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their thighs almost touching, their combined warmth a small shield against the cold. They ate their meal of beans and rabbit Elias had snared. The silence, comfortable, familiar, the rhythm of their breathing, the rise and fall of their chests, began to move in time. Two small, living things in a vast, empty world. Nell watched the fire. The wood he had gathered was piñón pine, and it popped, releasing a cloud of sharp, sweet resin. "I like that smell," she said, her voice low. "Pine, when it burns, it smells clean." Elias looked at her. The firelight played across the harsh planes of his face. He did not speak. He simply reached for the small stack of wood he had gathered, picked out the largest, most resinous log, and placed it carefully on the fire. The flames flared, bathing them in a sudden, bright light and releasing a thick, fragrant plume of smoke. It was an answer, a shared moment, small and perfect. The light reflected in their eyes, a small, unspoken promise. Not of a future, not of love, but of presence. He was here. He saw her. In the morning, the air was crystalline. As Nell was repacking her bedroll, her hands stiff from the cold, she winced. She looked down. A long, red scratch from a sharp branch the day before was oozing, the skin around it puckered and angry. Elias, packing his own gear, saw the small movement. He set down his coffee tin and walked over. "Let me see." She hesitated, then held out her hand. It was the calloused, capable hand of a worker, but it was also a woman's hand, and it was injured. Elias examined it, his expression unreadable. "It will go bad," he said. He went to his mule's pack and returned, not with a strip of linen, but with a small tin of dark, herbal salve. "Give it here," he commanded, his voice low. She placed her hand in his. His was scarred, the skin like cured leather, the nails broken. She expected his touch to be rough, but it was not. He took her hand as if it were a fragile, wounded bird, with an almost impossible gentleness. He used his thumb to spread the salve over the raw scratch. His touch was light, deliberate, and warm. He was treating her injury with a focused, quiet care that was more intimate than any passionate embrace. He then took a clean strip of cloth and wrapped it neatly around her knuckle, his movements practiced and economical. He tied the knot, his rough fingers brushing her palm. Nell watched his bent head, the way he concentrated on this small, simple task. It was a kindness so pure, so unexpected, that it cracked the hard, cynical armor she had built around her heart. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest. When he finished, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. A slow, genuine smile spread across Nell's face. Reaching her eyes, it was the first time she had truly smiled since the day Boone had destroyed her. The smile transformed her, erasing the lines of grief and anger. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice soft. He looked at her smile for a long moment, as if it were a thing he did not understand. He gave a single, curt nod, his own expression softening for just an instant, and then he turned away, back to his coffee and his mule. Later that day, they reached the high meadow. It was a small, hidden bowl of green, sheltered from the wind. The sheep, bleating in gratitude, immediately began to graze. "We will rest them here for a day," Elias said. He unshouldered the spyglass he always carried and climbed a low ridge that overlooked the entire basin. Nell, her hand now bandaged and her heart strangely light, followed him. From the ridge, the world fell away. They could see for 50 miles, and far below, in the wide brown expanse of the lowlands, they could see the twin mesas. "He is moving," Elias said, handing her the glass. Nell raised it to her eye. She focused the lens. The ranch yard was a hive of activity, but the activity was not at the ranch. It was in the south pasture. A large herd, her herd, was being held, and in the center of it, a plume of blue-gray smoke rose into the air. A branding fire. Her blood went cold. She adjusted the focus, her hand trembling. She could see them. She saw Skeeter. She saw the other hands. She saw them rope a large steer and pull it to the ground. She saw another man, his back to her, retrieve a glowing iron from the fire. And she saw the new brand. It was the one she had seen on Boone's false documents. A large B inside a C. She watched, her breath trapped in her chest, as they pressed the hot iron onto the steer's flank, burning it directly over the TM brand she had so meticulously recorded. They were not just branding, they were erasing. "He is destroying the proof," she whispered. The smile she had worn that morning vanished, her face hardening into a mask of cold, calculated fury. Her anger was no longer a hot, blinding grief. It was a plan. "He is preparing them for sale," Elias said, taking the spyglass and looking for himself. "He burns off the old brand, puts on his new holding company brand. When the Desert Crown buyers arrive, they will see only cattle legally marked to Twin Mesas Holdings. Your ledgers will be useless." He was right. They were running out of time. They stood on the ridge, the cold wind whipping at their clothes, two small figures against a vast, indifferent sky. "He has the law and the money and the men," Elias said, stating the fact. "He does not have the truth," Nell said, her voice low and vibrating with a new, terrible certainty. Her hand went to the ledger at her belt. "And he does not have this." She looked down at her bandaged hand, then at his. "He thinks he is a builder, but he is just a thief. He steals other people's work." She turned to face him, her eyes as hard and clear as the desert sky. "We are not going to fight him with bullets, Elias. We are going to fight him with his own crime, with the scars on those hides, with the truth I wrote down." Elias met her gaze. He understood the stakes. This was not just about cattle. It was about survival against a man who believed he was a god. "And if the truth is not enough?" he asked. "If the law sides with the man with the most money?" Nell looked at her own hands, the one he had bandaged, the one that was calloused and strong. "Then," she said, "we will fight him with these." Elias Kincaid held her gaze. He saw the woman who had faced down the haboob, who had saved his sheep, who had met his silence with her own strength. He saw a partner. He gave a single, slow nod. "With these," he agreed. The San Miguel Fair was the county's yearly exhale. It was a chaotic, hopeful gathering where dust, sweat, livestock, and the sharp tang of cheap whiskey mixed in the hot October air. It was a place for rodeo, for judging pies, and for settling accounts. Calder Boone was settling his in public. He stood on a bunting-draped wooden platform near the main cattle pens, the absolute picture of the magnanimous victor. Beside him stood two men in dark suits, their city pallor a stark contrast to the sun-scorched ranchers in the crowd. These were the men from the Desert Crown Canal Company. "The future of this territory," Boone was saying, his smooth voice rolling over the crowd, "is not in clinging to the old ways. It is in harnessing the land. It is in partnership the Desert Crown Company, gentlemen, is not just buying land. They are investing in our home. They bring water. They bring life." The crowd of ranchers and townsfolk, desperate after the drought, applauded. Boone was not just a rancher anymore. He was a statesman, the man who had brought the miracle of investment to Red Elk Crossing. He was selling them their own land back, disguised as progress. A wagon, its wheels caked in the dust of the high passes, had pulled into the livery 2 hours earlier. Nell and Elias had not gone to Washout Flats. They had gone to the one place in town that might offer an ally, the quiet adobe inn run by Salome Yazzie. Salome was a dine woman who had run the inn for 20 years. She had seen men like Boone rise and fall, and her face held the wisdom of the canyons. She listened to Nell's story without expression, her hands busy grinding corn. When Nell finished, Salome simply nodded. "He is a taker," she said. "He takes the land from my people. He takes the wages from your shepherd. He takes the name from you. It is the same sickness." She had given Nell a room, a bar of lye soap, and a bucket of hot water. An hour later, Nell emerged, scrubbed clean of the mountain grime. The only dress she owned, the gray broadcloth, was tattered and stained. Salome handed her a folded garment. It was a simple, heavy dress of black homespun. "A woman must meet her enemy in her own armor," she said. She also offered a heavy wool shawl, woven in a striking pattern of red and black. It was a mantle of protection. Now, Nell walked through the fairgrounds. The black dress made her stand out, stark and severe, against the calico and denim of the crowd. Elias was not beside her. He was a shadow, moving parallel to her through the maze of tents and wagons, his eyes scanning, always watching. As Nell approached the platform, a woman stepped directly into her path. She was dressed in bright green silk, a plume feather in her hat, her face heavily powdered. It was Odette LaRue, a saloon girl who had, for a time, been Boone's public companion. She saw Nell, and her painted smile curdled. "Well, look here." Odette's voice was a sharp, nasal whine. "The big, clumsy thief. I heard Boone ran you out for stealing. You have some nerve coming back, dressed like a funeral crow." Nell tried to step around her. "I have no business with you." "You have business with me," Odette shrieked, her jealousy and humiliation at being cast aside by Boone finding its target. "He never even looked at you until you started running his ranch. Did you think a woman like you could hold a man like him?" Odette lunged. She did not slap Nell. She did something far worse. She grabbed the neckline of the black dress with both hands and tore. The sound of ripping cloth was sharp, shocking. The crowd around them went silent. The dress, made of sturdy homespun, held for a moment and then gave way, tearing down Nell's chest, exposing the plain cotton shift beneath. It was a calculated act of humiliation, meant to strip her bare in front of the entire county. Nell froze, the hot blood of shame rushing to her face, worse than any insult she had ever endured. Before Odette could pull again, a shadow fell over them. Elias had moved, not with the speed of a fighter, but with the inevitability of a rock slide. He did not touch Odette. He simply inserted himself between the two women. In his hands was a thick horse blanket, grabbed from a nearby railing. He said nothing. He wrapped the coarse blanket around Nell's shoulders, covering the tear, covering her shift, shielding her from the pointing fingers and the sudden, cruel laughter. He pulled a short length of rope, a pigging string, from his belt and, with two efficient, impersonal movements, tied it around her waist, securing the blanket like a cloak. It was not an act of romance. It was an act of profound, practical defense. He looked at Odette. His eyes were flat, cold, and utterly devoid of fear. Odette, who preyed on weakness, saw none here. She took a step back, her bravado failing. Elias said nothing. He simply stepped aside, clearing Nell's path to the platform. Nell, wrapped in the dusty horse blanket, her black dress ruined, her face pale but set like iron, did not retreat. She walked past Odette. She walked through the silent, parting crowd, and she walked directly to the platform. "Mr. Boone!" she called out, her voice not a shout, but a clear, powerful command that cut through the fair's noise. Boone, interrupted, turned. His smile wavered for a fraction of a second when he saw her, wrapped in a horse blanket. Elias a few steps behind, but he recovered instantly. his smile becoming one of pity. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, loud enough for the crowd. "I did not expect to see you. I thought we had an agreement." "Our agreement was based on your lies," Nell said, stepping up onto the platform. She was taller than him. She was taller than the men from Desert Crown. She turned to the crowd, and in her hand was the small, battered ledger. "You all know me," she said. "You saw me work this ranch. You saw me build the trough. You saw me gentle the bay. And you heard I was a thief." Now, Miss Whitcomb," Boone said, stepping beside her, trying to put a calming hand on her arm. "There is no need to air your troubles in public. We were very generous." Nell shook his hand off as if it were a snake. She opened her book. "Mr. Boone claims I stole from him. He is now selling the Twin Mesas herd to the Desert Crown Company, but he is selling stolen goods." The crowd murmured. This was an accusation. "She is unwell," Boone said, his smile tight, his eyes cold. "She could not handle the stress of the job." "Ear tag 415. Nell read, her voice ringing. "A 3-year-old polled heifer, calved last spring, ear tag 280, a breeding bull, bought from the Sanderson Ranch in 1884. Ear tag 701, a yearling." She read 10 more numbers. "What is this nonsense?" the Desert Crown man asked. "Those," Nell said, "are the original, registered ear tags of the Twin Mesas herd, the herd I managed, the herd I documented." She looked out at the faces of the ranchers. "And you all know what a branding fire smells like. You know what it means to see smoke in a pasture when it is not round up. Ask Jedediah Smith. Ask Henry Cole. Ask them what they saw in the south pasture 3 nights ago." In the crowd, 2 men exchanged a look. One of them, a grizzled old rancher, spoke up, his voice reluctant. We did see a fire. Mr. Boone, thought it was strange. Looked like you was rebranding." The crowd's murmur grew. Rebranding was a thief's game. Boone's smile finally vanished, but he was not beaten. He was a creature of paper. He held up his hand for silence. "Rebranding. Of course we were rebranding. We were rebranding my property. Gentleman property that I have the full and legal title to." He reached into his coat and produced a folded, official-looking document. "This poor woman is confused. She was, as I said, overwhelmed. She came to me, begging for help. She authorized me to take control of the assets." He unfolded the paper, showing the top sheet. It was the transfer of movable assets. And at the bottom, large and clear, was her signature, Eleanor Whitcomb. And next to it, stamped in purple ink, was the official seal of the county clerk. "This," Boone said, his voice triumphant, "is the law. A signed, sealed document. Are you going to believe a woman's frantic lies, or the seal of this territory?" The crowd swayed back. The seal was irrefutable. The ranchers looked at the ground, ashamed to have spoken. Nell's ledger was just her word. Boone's paper was the law. She had signed it. But he did not file the other book, did he? The voice was thin, reedy, and shaking with terror. But it cut through the silence. Martha Dupre, the small, bird-like accountant, pushed her way to the front. She was clutching a heavy ledger, a duplicate of the one Boone kept. "Martha," Boone said, his voice hardening, "what is the meaning of this?" I could not, Mr. Boone," she stammered, climbing the steps, her eyes wide with fear. "I kept a shadow ledger. I always do. The numbers you told me, they were wrong." "This is madness," Boone snapped. "Is it?" Martha said, finding a strange, sudden strength. She opened her book on the railing, her small, ink-stained finger racing down a column. Mr. Boone accused Miss Whitcomb of embezzling feed, specifically 50 sacks of premium barley stolen on the 1st of September. "She signed for it," Boone said. "She thought I would not notice." "Yes," Martha said, her voice growing stronger. "She did sign for it, but you signed for it, too." She turned the page. "Here, a separate transfer, 50 sacks of barley, moved from the main granary. Not to the feedlot, not to the horses. It was transferred to the new Desert Crown storage warehouse at Sombra Verde, a warehouse leased in your name, Mr. Boone, and paid for with the ranch funds, one day before you accused Miss Whitcomb of the theft." The crowd was dead silent. "The salt lick you claimed she stole," Martha continued, her voice shaking but relentless. "It is here, transferred to the same warehouse. The wages for the missing men here, transferred to your personal account in Tucson. You did not just frame her. You made the ranch pay for the supplies you used to do it." Boone's face was no longer smiling. It was a mask of pure, white-hot rage. He looked, not at Martha, but into the crowd, at Skeeter and the other Twin Mesas hands he had hired. It was a silent, unmistakable command. "Shut her up." Skeeter and 2 other men started to push forward, their expressions dark, ready to drag the women off the platform. "That's enough," a new voice barked, sharp and official. Sheriff Reeves pushed his way through, his hand resting on his pistol. He was a paunchy man who disliked trouble. "Boone, you call your men off. Ma'am, you put that book away. This is a county fair, not a courtroom." "This man is a thief," Nell said, pointing at Boone. "And this woman is a runaway embezzler," Boone shot back. "I do not care what either of you are," Reeves said, stepping onto the platform and placing himself between them. "I am not having a riot on my hands. This mess," he gestured at the ledgers and the official papers, "is a matter for the circuit judge. He arrives on the 3rd. Until then, you all stand down. The assets are frozen, pending his review. Now, get off this platform, all of you." Boone, seething but smart, composed himself. He nodded at the sheriff, gave the crowd a pained, forgiving smile, and stepped down, his Desert Crown partners whispering urgently to him. Nell stood for a moment, her heart pounding. The horse blanket still clutched around her. She had not won, but she had not lost. She stepped down into the dust. The crowd, confused and uncertain, began to break apart. The show over. She looked for Martha, but the small accountant had already vanished, disappearing into the safety of the crowd. Nell felt a hand on her elbow. It was Elias. He did not speak. He just stood beside her, a solid presence in the swirling chaos. He looked at her, and his eyes were clear. He had seen the whole thing. He had seen her torn down, and he had seen her stand up. He leaned in, his voice low. "The next round will be fought in his church, with his priests." Nell understood. A courtroom, lawyers, paper. She felt his hand, still on her elbow. Give a single, tight squeeze. A brief, powerful connection that said everything. "I am here. We are not done." They both knew the battle at the fair was just the first shot. The real war, the one for her name, was still to come. The sky did not rain. It fell. The first sign was not water, but sound. A low, distant vibration, felt in the feet before it was heard in the ears. It was not the dry thunder of the haboob. It was a deep, guttural groaning from the earth, coming from the high ramparts of the Mongolian Rim, 50 miles to the east. Elias, standing near the livery, went still. His head came up, not looking at the sky, but at the ground. "That is not thunder," he said, his voice a low rumble. Nell, her arms crossed, the horse blanket folded and put away, now wearing only the ruined black dress and Salome's shawl, felt it too. "What is it?" "Rock," he said, "or water that moves rock." At the fairgrounds, the noise was building, a steady, terrifying roar that began to drown out the calls of the barkers and the laughter of the crowd. People looked up, confused. The sky above Red Elk Crossing was a clear, harsh blue. Then, from the mouth of the canyon that held the Sombra Verde Reservoir, It came. It was not a river. It was a wall. A 30-foot-high, churning brown wall of mud, boulders and uprooted trees, moving at the speed of a locomotive. The Desert Crown Canal Company, in its arrogance, had built a temporary earthen dam to divert the reservoir for their canals. The mountain storm, the one Elias had sensed, had hit the high country with apocalyptic force, and the dam, built of nothing but hubris and greed, had disintegrated. The wall of water struck the flat pasturelands with a sound like a cannonade. It obliterated the Desert Crown work camp, tossing heavy wagons like toys. "The herd," Nell breathed, her mind instantly calculating. The cattle, frozen by the sheriff's order, were penned in the low-lying stockyards on the edge of the fairgrounds. They smelled the mud, they heard the roar, and they exploded. The panic was absolute. 1,000 head of cattle, terrified, maddened by the sound, burst through the flimsy pine fences as if they were matchsticks. The herd became a single, massive organism, a stampede, running from the impossible noise. They ran west, away from the water, directly toward the only other barrier, the deep, sheer-walled arroyo that defined the town, the one the dry bridge crossed. "They will go over the edge!" Nell screamed. Chaos erupted. Townsfolk were screaming, running for the high ground of the main street. The flood, spreading out, was a viscous, surging lake of mud, swallowing tents and wagons. Nell was already running. She did not run from the water. She ran to the livery. She did not wait for permission. She grabbed the bridle of the first horse she saw, a big-chested roan, swung the saddle from the railing, and cinched it with 3 powerful pulls. Elias was right behind her. "The herd is blind," he yelled over the din. "They will follow the lead steers to their deaths." Nell was already in the saddle. "I have to turn them north to the high ground." She kicked the roan, plunging it into the knee-deep mud that was once the fairground street. She rode with a terrifying, focused fury, not with the herd, but against it. She had to get in front, to intercept the leaders. The horse, sensing the terror in the air, gave her everything it had, its hooves sucking at the mud, its breath tearing in its chest. She cut across the flat, the churning water from the main flood wave just yards to her left. She could see the leaders, their eyes white with terror, their horns tossing. They were perhaps 200 yards from the arroyo's edge. She unslung the heavy wool shawl from her shoulders. It was the one from Salome. Her armor. She rode directly at the lead bull, a massive, branded animal. She pulled her horse alongside, screaming, her voice raw. She flapped the heavy red and black shawl like a wing, a matador facing a 1,000-ton beast. "Ya, turn, damn you!" The bull, already blind with panic, saw this new flapping, screaming thing in its path. It shied, hooking its head, and veered to the right, to the north, away from the arroyo. The wave of cattle behind it, that massive, mindless body, began to turn with its head. But they were not safe. They had turned from the cliff, only to be funneled into a new trap, a narrower, secondary wash, a tributary to the main arroyo, was now a raging 50-foot-wide river. The herd, still running, piled up against its muddy, treacherous bank. They were trapped between 2 torrents. Elias arrived, not on his mule, but on a heavy draft horse he had liberated from a Desert Crown wagon. He saw the new problem instantly. The cattle were in a pocket, and the floodwaters were rising behind them. "There!" he bellowed, pointing. 100 yards up, the tributary narrowed. It was still a 30-foot gap, a raging channel of debris, but it was narrower. Lying nearby, abandoned by the fleeing workers, was a heavy timber beam, a 60-foot pole meant for a dredging rig. Elias jumped from the horse. He ran to the beam. He was not strong enough to lift it, but he did not have to. He put his shoulder to one end, using the log it rested on as a fulcrum. With a roar of effort, he pushed. The massive pole pivoted, swung out over the raging water, and slammed into the opposite bank, its end biting deep into the mud. It was not a bridge. It was a single, treacherous log. "Nell!" he roared. Nell saw it. She looked at the log. She looked at the terrified cattle. She looked at the rising water. She did not hesitate. She drove her horse toward the new bridge. The roan shied, its eyes rolling at the churning water below. "Go!" Nell screamed, digging her heels in. The horse leaped, its hooves landing on the wet, vibrating timber. For 3 terrifying seconds, it balanced, slipping, finding its footing on the bark. And then it was across, landing on the stable far bank. Nell did not pause. Lying nearby was the wreckage of a dredging machine. A thick steel cable, at least 2 inches thick, spilled from its broken winch drum. She jumped from the horse, grabbing the heavy, mud-covered cable. She dragged it, her arms screaming with the strain, to the largest tree on the bank, a massive, ancient cottonwood. She wrapped the cable, found the hook, and secured it. She now held the other end of the cable, a lifeline, in her hands. Elias, on his side, had already uncoiled a long lariat. He spurred his horse into the edge of the stampede, roping the lead bull. He dragged it, fighting, toward his end of the makeshift bridge. The bull, seeing the narrow path, refused. Nell, on her side, flapped the shawl, screaming. Caught between the 2 humans, the bull finally lunged, scrambling across the timber. The moment it was on her side, Nell dropped the cable and grabbed its horns, turning it north onto the high pasture. Another followed, and another. Elias crossed on the timber, his feet sure, and together they worked in a furious, desperate rhythm. They created a new stampede, a controlled one, across the single log, turning the herd from certain death. They did not save them all. Dozens were lost, swept away by the current, but the core of the herd, the majority, was saved. They stood on the high ground, the exhausted cattle milling behind them, their chests heaving. The sound of the surviving animals, their panicked bellows, was like a second thunder, echoing off the rock walls. It was then, in the relative quiet, that Nell heard it, a human cry. She looked down. The main flood was still a churning, angry river of mud. In the center of it, 100 yards downstream, a piece of Desert Crown machinery, a steam boiler, had half-surfaced. Clinging to its hot metal casing was a man. His clothes were torn, and his face was a mask of terror. He was screaming, but the water was pulling his perch apart. "Elias," she pointed. The townsfolk, including Sheriff Reeves, had gathered on the high bluff of the main street, a silent, stunned audience to the entire rescue. They watched as Nell ran back to the spool of winch cable. "Hold me!" she yelled to Elias. She did not wait for his answer. She tied the heavy, abrasive cable around her own waist, knotting it with the speed and certainty of a woman who had worked rope her entire life. She was still wearing the ruined black dress and Salome's soaking, mud-caked shawl. "Nell, know the debris," Elias shouted, grabbing the main line. She was already moving. She plunged into the churning, viscous water. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. The current was not a river. It was a solid, moving mass of mud, tree limbs, and drowned animals. It grabbed her, trying to pull her under. She did not swim. She clawed. She fought. She pulled herself forward. Elias stood on the bank, his legs braced, the steel cable wrapped around his arms, his muscles straining. He was her anchor. He was the only thing keeping her from being swept into the arroyo and dashed against the rocks. He played the line out, his eyes fixed on her head, a single dark spot in the brown chaos. A heavy log, an entire tree, rolled toward her. Elias saw it. "Down!" he roared. Nell submerged, the filthy water closing over her head. The log rolled over her, the force of it tearing the shawl from her back. She came up, gasping, but she kept moving. The man on the boiler saw her. He reached out a desperate hand. She reached him just as the boiler began to list, slipping back into the current. "Grab me!" she screamed. She grabbed the front of his shirt, and he latched onto her. A drowning man's grip. "Now!" Elias, pull. Elias leaned back, his boots digging trenches in the mud. He became a human winch. He pulled, hand over hand, fighting the dead weight of two bodies and the godlike force of the flood. The cable went taut, vibrating like a guitar string. Nell, holding the man, was dragged backward through the water, her body a shield. She was battered, scraped, and half drowned, but she did not let go. The crowd on the bluff was silent, watching this impossible act. They watched as Elias, his face a mask of superhuman effort, dragged both of them, inch by agonizing inch, from the torrent. Nell and the man she had saved collapsed onto the muddy bank, vomiting water and silt. Elias ran to her, cutting the cable from her waist with his knife. The man, a young canal worker, just a boy, looked at her, his eyes wide with shock and gratitude. You, he stammered. Nell just lay on her back, breathing. The community saw it. They saw the woman who had been branded a thief, wrapped in rags, ride into a stampede and swim into a flood. They saw her risk her own life to save one of her accusers. And then Calder Boone arrived. He rode up on his fine horse, dry and clean, his face a thundercloud of black rage. He saw his ruined herd, the broken dam, the chaos. "Sabotage!" he bellowed, his voice cracking. "This was sabotage. That dam was sound, it was blown. These vagrants." He pointed at Nell and Elias. "They did this to ruin me." His voice, so powerful on the platform, was thin against the roar of the receding water. The crowd was not looking at him. They were looking at Nell. Nell, with Elias's help, got to her feet. She was covered in mud, her dress in tatters, her hair a wild mat. She was the most powerful person in the county. She walked directly up to Boone's horse, the water squelching in her boots. She looked up at him, her eyes as clear and cold as the spring water in the mountains. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying over the sound of the flood. "At the town hall. The judge is here. I am bringing the truth." She poked a muddy finger at his chest. "You bring your lawyer." The Red Elk Town Hall was not a courtroom. It was a large, rectangular wooden box that smelled of stale tobacco, oiled floors, and, now, the pervasive damp earth tang of the recent flood. Every bench was full. Men who had lost their homes in the flood stood shoulder to shoulder against the back wall, their boots caked in mud. They were not here for entertainment. They were here for a reckoning. At the front, at a heavy oak table, sat Circuit Judge Thorne. He was a man with a face like cured leather, his eyes holding the weary patience of a man who had seen every sin the territory had to offer. Calder Boone was at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his lawyer, Mr. Finch. Boone looked immaculate. His suit was pressed, his boots polished. He was the picture of aggrieved civilization. He leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled, projecting an aura of absolute, unassailable confidence. At the other table sat Nell, Elias, Martha Dupree, and Salome Yazzie. Nell wore the plain brown dress. Her hands were clasped on the table in front of her, the small, worn knife Elias had given her tucked deep in her pocket, a solid piece of ballast. "Mr. Finch," the judge said, his voice a low gravel. "Begin." Finch rose. He was smooth, practiced, and utterly dismissive. "Your Honor, this is not a trial. It is a simple administrative hearing that has been blown out of proportion by a hysterical woman in a catastrophic flood." He produced the document. "We have here a legal, binding transfer of assets, signed by Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, notarized and sealed by the county clerk's office. This document transfers the assets of the Twin Mesas herd to Mr. Boone's holding company. It is the law, immutable. We are here simply to ask you to affirm this legal transfer, which Sheriff Reeves has so erroneously frozen." He handed the document to the judge. The purple county seal was bright and official. The crowd murmured. In the West, a man's signature was his bond, and a county seal was his religion. "Miss Whitcomb," Judge Thorne said, not looking at her. "Your name is on this paper. What is your answer?" Nell stood. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the room. "The paper is a lie, the seal is a lie, and the signature is a forgery. I call Miss Martha Dupree." Martha, pale and trembling, walked to the front. Finch scoffed. "Your Honor, a bookkeeping dispute. We are wasting the court's time." "Sit down, Mr. Finch," the judge said. "Speak, Miss Dupree." Martha opened her shadow ledger. Her voice, at first a whisper, gained strength as she spoke her truth. "Mr. Boone claimed Miss Whitcomb embezzled 50 sacks of barley, but my ledger shows Mr. Boone himself signed a transfer order for that exact amount on the same day, moving it to a Desert Crown warehouse he had leased. He did not lose the grain, he hid it, and he blamed her. She detailed the salt lick. She detailed the payroll. With every entry, Boone's motive became clearer. This was not a business deal. It was a theft, planned months in advance. The crowd's gaze, once respectful, turned cold, speculative. Finch was on his feet. Lies, the bookkeeping of a jealous, failing employee. "Then, perhaps," Nell said, "we should ask why the county seal was so easily obtained. I call Salome Yazzie." Salome stood, her presence filling the room with an ancient, quiet authority. "I saw Calder Boone with the county clerk, Mr. Davis. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Boone was carrying a bottle of fine whiskey. He called it reviewing a map. Mr. Davis is a man who sells his thirst. Boone bought it, he bought it, and he left with a stamp on his paper." A gasp went through the room. The seal was tainted. "Gossip," Finch shouted. "Slander from a barkeep." "And what of the time?" Nell's voice cut through his. "I call Father Mateo." The priest stood, his face sad. "I was in the bell tower 3 nights ago. The night before the fair, I rang the 9 o'clock vespers." "And what did you see?" Father, Nell asked. "I saw a fire in the Twin Mesas pasture," the priest said. "I heard shouting. They were branding. It was late, 9:30. Nell turned to the judge. 9:30, Your Honor. Long after the clerk's office had closed. Long after this legal transfer was supposedly signed. He was rebranding cattle that were not yet legally his, burning his new mark over the old one to hide the truth before the Desert Crown buyers arrived. That is not the act of an owner. It is the act of a thief preparing his stolen goods for sale. Finch was laughing, a sharp, ugly sound. "This is a theater of the absurd. You have gossip, you have timelines, you have a disgruntled shepherd." He slammed his hand on his own table. "We have the law. We have her signature. Where is your proof?" "Here," Elias Kincaid said. He stepped forward. He was not dressed for court. He was muddy, grim, and he carried 3 items. He placed them on the judge's table with a series of heavy, definitive thuds. The first was the old, rusted TM branding iron, the iron that built the Twin Mesas herd, Elias said. The second was the new, shiny BC iron, the one he had pulled from the mud near the branding fire, the iron that stole it. The third item made the courtroom recoil. It was a heavy, stiff, cured piece of hide, cut from one of the steers killed in the flood. The stench of mud and death filled the air. On it, clearly visible, was the double brand. "A brand is a scar, Your Honor," Elias said, his voice low, "and a scar tells the truth." He unclipped a small pouch from his belt, ash from Salome's stove. He dumped the fine gray powder onto the hide and began to rub it, his calloused palm working the ash into the scarred leather. "Boone was arrogant," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "He was in a hurry. He burned hot, and he burned fast, but he could not burn deep enough." The ash filled the newer, shallower BC brand. but it also settled into the older, deeper wound beneath it. The TM, blurred but unmistakable, emerged from beneath the forgery. It was a brand on top of a brand. It was a lie, written in flesh. The jury, the ranchers in the front row, leaned in. They knew hides. They knew scars. They knew fraud when they saw it. A low, angry growl started at the front of the room and spread to the back. Boone was no longer smiling. He was pale, his mask of civilization stripped away. Judge Thorne looked at the hide for a long, silent moment. He looked at Boone. Then he looked at Nell. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "I have before me a document with your signature. I also have this evidence, and I have the sworn affidavit you filed this morning." He pulled Nell's handwritten statement from his desk. He laid it next to Boone's transfer document. He looked at the two signatures, side by side. The courtroom held its breath. The judge stared at the papers. "Mr. Finch, I am not a handwriting expert, but a man does not need to be a smith to know the difference between iron and tin." He pointed. "This signature," he tapped Nell's affidavit, "is fast. It is sure. It moves forward, like a person with work to do." Then he pointed to the forged document. "This signature is slow. It is hesitant. The ink is heavier. Look at the W. It does not flow. It drags. It drags to the left. It is the hand of a man drawing a picture of a name he is not used to writing. It is the hand of a forger." He picked up the transfer of assets. The room was dead silent. He tore it in half. "This document is a fraud," he thundered. "The transfer is void. The assets are restored to the state they were in before this conspiracy." For a single second, Calder Boone sat frozen. Then, his face, a mask of pure, reptilian rage, shattered. He was not a statesman. He was an animal. He kicked his chair back and bolted, running not for the main door, but for the side door leading to the alley. He never made it. Sheriff Reeves, his face grim, his duty finally clear, blocked the exit. Boone slammed into him. He did not fight. He just stared. Trapped. Reeves pulled the heavy iron cuffs from his belt. "Calder Boone," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You are under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud." The sound of the cuffs closing, that final, metallic click-click, was the loudest sound Nell had ever heard. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on a season of injustice. It was the sound of her name, coming back to her, clean. The moon was high, the stars like sharp, cold diamonds. The town of Red Elk Crossing, exhausted from the flood and the trial, was asleep. The only sound was the distant rush of the creek, still swollen, and the sigh of the wind through the wet pines. Nell and Elias walked. They did not walk to the inn, or to the flats. They walked to the old, sturdy barn at the edge of the fairgrounds, the one that had been saved from the flood, the one where they had turned the herd. They stood in the deep shadow of the doorway. The air inside was cool, smelling of damp earth, old hay, and the sharp, clean scent of pine. A single lantern, left by a stockman, cast a small, warm circle of golden light on the packed earth floor. They had not spoken since they left the courtroom. There were no words. The victory was too large, the cost too high. Nell was shaking. The adrenaline, the rage, the terror that had held her upright for weeks was gone, and in its place was a bone-deep, hollow exhaustion. She felt the cold night air seep into her. Elias saw her shiver. He stepped into the lantern light. He stood in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. They just looked at each other, two survivors in the quiet dark. He lifted his hands. They were not the hands of a lawyer or a rancher. They were the hands that had mended her boots, that had held the line in the flood, that had exposed the lie. They were scarred, rough, and steady. Gently, he placed them on her shoulders. She did not flinch. She did not move. He slid them up, cupping her face. his thumbs resting on her cheekbones. His touch was hesitant, reverent. "It is over," he whispered, his voice rough. "It is over," she agreed, her own voice barely audible. He tilted his head, his gaze searching her face, and he pressed his forehead against hers. It was an anchor. It was the first moment of pure, absolute stillness she had known in years. His breath was warm on her skin. Her breath hitched. She closed her eyes. His thumb moved, slowly, brushing across her cheek. He found a small, faint streak of dried mud, a remnant of the flood, a mark of her ordeal. He gently wiped it away. He was not just cleaning her face. He was cleansing the wound. She lifted her hands, slowly, and placed them on his chest. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. It was the surest thing in the world. He leaned back, just an inch, enough to see her eyes, and then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of hunger. It was a kiss of arrival. It was slow and deep and as certain as the sunrise. It was hesitant at first, a question, and then, as she responded, it became a statement. It was the taste of coffee and dust and truth. It was two people, broken by the world, learning how to be whole. His breath, or hers, hitched. Her hands moved from his chest, sliding up and around his neck, her fingers sinking into his hair. His arms went around her, circling her waist, pulling her tight, pulling her in until there was no space left between them. They stumbled, a single step, leaning back against one of the massive wooden support posts, the rough bark biting into her back through the thin wool. He held her as if he was holding the line in the flood, as if she was the only thing keeping him from being swept away. She clung to him, her face buried in his neck, breathing in the scent of him, the scent of leather and soap, and the wild, clean wind of the high passes. He whispered things into her hair, words she could not and did not need to understand. They were not words, they were sounds, a promise, spoken in a language of breath and touch, a vow that, from now on, we are together. They stood, locked together in the small, warm circle of the lantern, their shadows thrown long and single against the wall. They held each other, the embrace tight, the kisses long and searching, a silent confirmation that they had survived. Finally, when their hearts had said enough, they pulled back, their foreheads still touching. Their breath was ragged, their faces illuminated in the warm, gentle light. Elias looked at her, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. He took off his own heavy canvas coat, the one that had weathered the haboob, the one that smelled of him. He draped it over her shoulders, pulling the lapels closed, cocooning her in his warmth. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, an act of treasuring. He was shielding her, not from the world, but for himself. The gavel fell with the finality of a spadeful of dirt on a coffin. Judge Thorne's ruling was as sharp and unyielding as the landscape itself. Calder Boone, his assets seized, was to make full restitution. The court, citing gross negligence and public endangerment, levied a fine against the Desert Crown Canal Company so severe it would echo in Phoenix boardrooms for a decade. The dam was ruled illegal, its very existence an act of corporate arrogance. The herd, or what was left of it after the flood and the fraud, was returned to Nell's stewardship. The granary, its seal now broken by the sheriff, was hers to manage. The ledgers, both hers and Martha's, were entered as official county record. Nell Whitcomb walked out of the town hall into the muddy street, not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as the master of the Twin Mesas. She rode back to the ranch that afternoon. Elias was at her side. The remaining hands, including Skeeter, were gathered by the cookhouse, the same place they had stood in judgment of her. They were silent, their hats in their hands, their faces a mixture of shame and uncertainty. They were men without a master, without wages. and they expected to be cast out. Nell dismounted. She walked up to them. She looked at Skeeter, her gaze level and clear. "Mr. Boone is in jail," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet yard. "His corporation is dissolved. The ranch—" She paused, looking at the familiar, damaged buildings. "The ranch remains. The flood left a scar. There is work to be done. The ditches are full. The north pasture fence is gone. The herd is scattered, and what is left is thin." She looked at each man. "I am not Mr. Boone. I do not deal in lies. I am offering you a job. An honest day's pay, in silver, for an honest day's work. We will clear the mud. We will rebuild the fences. We will follow the water laws. We will bring this place back the right way. Your pay starts today. If you are staying, get your shovels. If you are not, take your things and ride out." Skeeter looked at the ground. He looked at the hard, muddy work that lay ahead. He looked at the woman who had faced down a stampede. He slowly, deliberately, put his hat back on his head. "The mud in the main irrigation ditch," he said, his voice rough. "It is deep. We will need the draft horses." "Then harness them, Mr. Skeeter," Nell replied. She did not fire a single one. The work of restoration was brutal, but it was clean. Nell worked alongside them, her hands in the same mud, her shoulders straining against the same timbers. She was not a foreman who pointed. She was a leader who pulled. And the ranch, which had been poisoned by Boone's greed, was purified by their shared sweat. 3 weeks later, she stood with Elias on the small rise overlooking the main gate. He was holding a long, smooth plank of cypress. Nell held a can of black paint and a brush. "Twin mesas," she said, looking at the old, faded sign. "It was his. It was a lie." "A name is just a word," Elias said, "until you give it a meaning." "I have a new word," she said. She dipped the brush. She had seen Elias build his impossible, single-log bridge across the raging flood. She thought of the way his hand had felt in hers, a bridge across her own fear. She began to paint. Her strokes were sure, the same strokes she used in her ledgers. Heartspan Ranch. "The span," she said, more to herself. "Across the arroyo, across what seems impossible." Elias looked at the name. He looked at her. He understood. It was the span of their two hearts, forged in the flood, built on a foundation of truth. The ranch was no longer a place of deceit. It became a sanctuary. The community that had been forged in the kitchen of the Adobe Inn became the new foundation. Martha Dupre, her fear gone, arrived twice a week. Her small, sharp-penciled figures now a source of pride and strength. She was not just an accountant. She was the treasurer of their new world. Salome Yazzie, declaring that a ranch that does not feed its people is just a patch of dirt, took over the cookhouse. She brought with her the sense of juniper smoke, fresh bread, and slow-cooked chili. The men ate, not with the hurried anxiety of Boone's tenure, but with the quiet satisfaction of men who were respected. And on the first day of the new planting, Father Mateo came. He did not come to lecture. He came to bless the seeds. His quiet presence a sign that the moral center of the county had shifted, realigning itself with the heartspan. Elias did not return to his sheep camp in the high passes. His flock, combined with hers, was now part of the ranch. He was no longer a hired hand, a ghost at the edges. He was the other half of the heartspan. He began to build on the hill overlooking the main yard, the same hill where Nell had first seen him. He laid a foundation of river stone. He cut and planed cypress, the same wood Nell had used for her water trough. He was not building a foreman's cabin. He was building a house. He worked with the same steady, economical grace he had used to build the Ocotillo fence. Nell would come and sit, her ledgers in her lap, watching the walls go up. The sound of his hammer was not the sound of her solitary toil. It was the sound of a future being constructed, nail by nail. Every evening, as the sun began to dip, They would walk. The land, nourished by the flood's silt, was already showing a faint, miraculous fuzz of new green grass. They would walk, side by side, their hands clasped. They did not speak of the trial, or of the betrayal. They spoke of the things that mattered. "We need a new bull," Nell said one night, her gaze on the resting herd. "One that throws smaller calves, the breed from the high desert. They are built for a drought." "They are," Elias agreed, his thumb rubbing the back of her hand. "But their meat is lean. We would get less at market." "I would rather have a living animal that is lean," she countered, "than a dead one that was fat. We have to plan for the next drought, not the last one." "The hay in the high meadow," he said. "It is ready to cut. We can get 2 cuttings before the first frost, if we move fast." "And the sheep," she smiled. "They need to be sheared." "I will teach you," he said. They were partners. Their romance was not in grand gestures, but in the shared language of futures, of crops, of livestock, and of survival. The harvest festival came. It was held in the shadow of the repaired town hall. This time, there was no tension. There was celebration. The flood, for all its destruction, had washed the county clean. Nell and Elias walked through the crowd. No one stared. No one whispered. Odette LaRue, seeing her, simply turned and hurried into the saloon. The ranchers, the ones who had muttered about rebranding, tipped their hats. "Miss Whitcomb," Jedediah Smith said, the old rancher approaching them. "Mr. Kincaid." "Jedediah," Nell nodded. "The story," he said, "of what you did at the fair and at the flood. My children, they are telling it. They say you rode the stampede like a hawk and swam the mud like an otter. The malicious gossip, the lies that had branded her a thief, were gone. They had been replaced by a legend, a story told over campfires and in kitchens. The rumors had died, as quiet as sand settling after a long rain. That night, they stood on the porch of the new house. The cypress was still pale, smelling of resin and fresh cuts. The windows were dark, the house not yet finished. But it was theirs. Nell stood, leaning her shoulder against the new post. She held the small, worn knife Elias had given her. She did not need it for courage anymore. It was just a part of her. Elias came and stood beside her, his hand finding hers in the twilight, lacing his fingers with hers. "That day," Nell said, her voice quiet. "The day he took everything, I stood in that yard and I told him I'd rather die." Elias said nothing. He just held her hand, his presence a solid, warm thing in the cool desert air. "Today," she said, turning to look at him, her face illuminated in the deep twilight, "I have never felt more alive." He smiled, that slow, rare smile that reached his eyes. He squeezed her hand. They turned and looked out at the horizon. The desert was vast, the sky a deep, bruised purple. The setting sun, a final, brilliant streak of fire, caught their 2 silhouettes, casting them as one long shadow across the new grass. It was an ending, but it was also a beginning. The air was clean, the land was healing, and the stories of the Heartspan Ranch had only just begun. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks.